In most families, stories are passed down from one generation to the next, while others are quietly swept under the rug. My family is like all families and like no other. My name is Harriet, like my mother and my great-grandmother. I grew up in Europe with my parents, my 5 sisters and my brother. Today, we live all over the world and have families of our own. But as our children grew up, I realized how little they know about the one thing we all have in common. All of us are related to one man, Edward Jones. His blood runs in our veins, and yet his story has been kept secret from us.
What do I know about Edward?
Edward Jones?
I really don't know.
Lo único que sé es que es mi bisabuelo y que era el hombre de color más rico de Estados Unidos.
All I know is that his stomping grounds were here in Chicago.
As we of the United States Senate committed to investigate the tremendous importance of organized crime, it's even greater than we thought it was, both from the viewpoint of criminal activity itself.
In 1951, the Senate conducted a series of televised public hearings exposing the extent to which the criminal underworld penetrated U.S. affairs. Edward Jones was called to testify before those hearings. The FBI wanted answers, and so did I.
I mean, the first time I heard about Edward Jones was through Mom. She used to talk about him, not much, very little, but that's how I heard about him.
My mother really limited herself to tell us that her father was incredible.
Je ne sais pas grand-chose sur Edward Jones. Toute mon enfance, je n'ai jamais entendu parler de lui.
It was difficult for her to talk about it, never talked about it, and if she did, it was really half words. So it was a big mystery, at least to me.
Pourquoi on n'en a jamais entendu parler? Je suppose que quelque chose a dû déranger maman.
My name is Harriet, and I'm the daughter of Edward Jones. My father, Edward Jones, he was a gentleman. He was just a good person.
This is what my mother had chosen to pass on as we were growing up. But I needed to go much deeper if I wanted to know who Edward Jones really was and unravel the mystery surrounding him. Who was this man that once made the government quiver? Searching for the truth, I went looking for answers. how did this shadowy figure shape our family? It was time for me to dig into the past and question the present.
My grandfather was a reverend of the Baptist Church. His name, of course, was Edward Perry Jones, just like my father. And he had a big Baptist church. He was very well known, at least in Mississippi. They had 4 boys, my father, Edward, my Uncle George, my Uncle Mac, and a baby who died when he was 3 years old. They had a very good life in Mississippi. All of the sons played an instrument. They did horseback riding, but I mean, you know, not the riding the way people would ride. They did manège. My grandfather had a very important position in the Republican Party. They had the first car of the town. My father, who was 12 years old, would drive the car to the railroad station and pick people up. He would make a little money doing that. There was a white family who lived very close, and the young girl, a white girl, came to borrow sugar or something. When she was leaving, my father accompanied her to the door, and someone in the KKK was passing. And so they sent threats to my grandfather and said, watch out. My grandfather, he didn't wait for something to happen. He took the whole family and left to Chicago.
Reverend Jones uprooted his family and headed towards the more liberal northern states. During the Great Migration, more than 6 million African Americans fled the South to escape poverty and the Ku Klux Klan. My grandfather vowed never to return to Mississippi.
The railroad came straight up through Mississippi and Alabama to Chicago. Men like my father, who had skills and desires for the future, had fled because of the terror that they exposed to, came to Chicago to get better opportunities and to be able to vote.
The black migration was kicked off by the Chicago Defender because you could not live in the South in those days, and I mean, you could get a job, but I mean, what kind of job could you get? A black person could leave the South and come and have 2 jobs in a day. He could work at the stockyard, and he could also work out in the steel mill. My father made a Defender in the 30s, 40s. We sold at least 250,000 papers once a week. Everybody stuck together in the community because they didn't have anything but the black community.
Here we are in Evanston, north of Chicago. This was the first church home in Illinois for Reverend Dr. Edward Perry Jones, father of the Jones brothers. He was a fire and brimstone Baptist minister. So this is where the Illinois Trail begins for the Jones brothers.
When my father was in Evanston, he was going to the University of Northwestern, and he was studying pre-med.
Edward Jones pursued a profession suited to a minister's son, but in the North, discrimination took on other forms. As he entered Northwestern, an elite university almost entirely white, he quickly understood that he would always be underestimated because of the color of his skin. Instead of dwelling on it, it gave him wings.
At the same time he was studying, he had a car business.
My grandfather was earning good money operating his own taxicab business. The city seemed to offer great opportunities for ambitious young men. But once again, the American dream wasn't equally available.
My father and my Uncle George would tell me that when they were walking on the sidewalk, they would have to get off so white people could walk on the sidewalk.
Partager l'espace public avec les Noirs leur était insupportable. Et ils ont mis en place une série de coutumes, de pratiques qui ensuite ont été reconnues comme constitutionnelles par la Cour suprême des États-Unis, visant à instaurer ce que l'on peut appeler un apartheid américain, visant à maintenir les Noirs non seulement séparés, mais dans un statut d'infériorité permanente. Des écoles de moindre qualité, des théâtres de moindre qualité, des bureaux de vote très très éloignés, une intimidation constante et l'interdiction de s'élever et de relever la tête.
Le one-drop rule, c'est une loi raciste qui fait que n'importe quelle personne qui a aux États-Unis une goutte, that's the one-drop rule, une goutte de sang noir, est considérée complètement noire. Toi et moi, on sera à l'époque de maman. Nous n'aurions pas accès aux restaurants des Blancs, aux fontaines.
Depending on what color you are, what's going to happen to you is going to be dramatically different.
Listening to them, I realized that neither my children, my nieces or my nephews, or anyone for that matter who wasn't 100% white, could have gotten in, and we would have all become second-class citizens. The words white supremacy began pounding in my head.
before then, I couldn't even imagine. Wasn't easy. I mean, they're still to this day, it's not even that easy. There were riots yesterday, not riots, I guess more like peace protests over killings of a black teenager. So it's notably more difficult for someone of different color skin to, you know, become as successful as he did back then.
In those days, things were really divided according to ethnicity. There was an Irish neighborhood, there was a German neighborhood, there was an Italian neighborhood, and there was a Polish neighborhood, Lithuanian neighborhood. That's about 90% of Anglo-Chicago right there. Then there was African-American neighborhoods. I think most white folks didn't go into African-American neighborhoods, and I don't think many African-Americans went into white people's neighborhoods either.
In August of 1919, some young black men came to the 31st Street beach at Lake Michigan. Blacks could only swim on one part of that lake, and if they swam outside of that part, they were violating the rule. They were gangs, and they ganged up on this young man and drowned him. The population that had fled the South began to fight back. They were outraged. And young men who had served in World War I, they fought back because they were experienced soldiers. That was the first time in the history of this country that there had been a retaliation for attack on blacks in this country.
The Chicago race riots of 1919 left more than 1,000 African Americans homeless as whites torched their homes. After fleeing the South, they were forced to flee again. Red Summer is considered the awakening of Black America. My grandfather was 22 years old, and these riots marked him for life. Without thinking twice, he left Northwestern to enroll at Howard, an all-black university in Washington, D.C.
When he was studying medicine, at the time he was working for the train, supporting himself. He was a dining car supervisor. There's stories that he was running crap games and card games in one of the back cars with some of the regular riders. It's probably easier for a black man at that time to go into gambling as opposed to believing you're going to end up practicing medicine in a hospital.
These high-end professional occupations that African Americans are in today, those weren't available to a lot of African Americans in those days. If you really want to do well in business, he might have taken the path that led him to the greatest success.
In 1924, my great-grandfather, Reverend Edward Perry Jones, died from a heart attack at the age of 52. A firm believer that all men are created equal, his sermons left a deep impact on his family and his congregation. But now that he was gone, his 3 sons were free to explore their own path.
After Reverend Jones died and the elder sons came home, they ultimately found their way into the policy and numbers rackets. Policy and numbers rackets are what you know today as the state lottery. But long before there was a state lottery, there was this illegal numbers game called policy, owned, operated, and controlled by black men called policy kings and numbers racketeers.
The policy racket was a form of gambling that was affordable to the mass public. So it gave the everyday man or woman an opportunity to strike it rich. And everyday people would play the policy. There were many places where they could place their bets all around the south side of Chicago, which is where it began, in what became a thriving African-American community known as Brownsville.
African Americans in Chicago, particularly on the South Side, had a rich tradition of casino gambling, dice games, card games. Before the advent of policy, while policy was in its infancy, black organized crime within the black community in the form of illicit gambling was already thriving.
Uncle Mac, he was working in a policy office. So he was telling my father, wow, you know, it's not bad that. And so my father said, okay. And my father, he understood numbers. He would take a whole long list of numbers and he would be able to just calculate it like that or immediately.
If you bet a nickel on a number and it comes out, you might win $5. A lot of people might put $10 on one number, and if that one number falls out, then they're picking up $500. They're picking up $1,000.
When my grandfather died, I think my grandmother, she had an insurance for $16,000 or something like that, and she gave it to her sons.
We had to get to State Street, because the station was right off of Wabash. We had 40, what?
48th in Michigan, right?
48,
here.
Right.
This is the first policy station owned by the Jones brothers. So people would come in here and place their bets. Now, the front half was a tailor shop. So when you first walk in, you're gonna see garments. You're gonna see fabric. Probably some guy standing in there with a tape measure around his neck. That's the whole front. It has to look legitimate. But in the back, it's policy action. You got a bunch of guys sitting around, counting all this money, getting it ready to go to the bank. There's a big rivalry going on between this policy station and the policy station in the barbershop across the street. Mac used to work for that guy. Ezra Leak was one of the better known guys and one of the leading guys of the time. The Jones brothers, people liked them, people respected them. Ezra Leak was more of a street hustler type. The rivalry was just intense.
My grandmother told them, whatever you do with the policy, always be totally honest. Whoever makes the money, you give the money immediately. And people appreciated that.
In less than 2 years, they became the leading #1 policy wheel in town. How many of the policy operators got relegated to the back seat because of the Jones brothers? How did that happen? They had to be very well liked and very well trusted.
With color as a barrier, my grandfather pursued a color that supposedly bore no discrimination: green, the color of money. It would be his key to freedom.
This is one of the most historic buildings in all of Chicago. And your grandfather and his brothers had a lot to do with this.
Okay, let's go there.
At noon, when they're getting ready to pull the numbers for the midday drawing, a lot of people would find their way here. Of course, they would go around to the alley and go in through a back door and come up in one of the rooms where the drawing was set up.
Sometimes my father would take my brother and I down to the policy wheel to watch them draw the numbers. I would see Ed there watching as the policy numbers would be drawn out.
The winning numbers for policy are derived by pulling the winning numbers from a drum. So you get the term policy wheel. It actually comes from the crank on the drum that you're mixing the numbers up in and that you're going to be drawing the winning numbers from.
It was like a gathering place where they would stop and talk and gossip about what was going on while they played their numbers. So they went to the station to have fun, as well as try to make some money with their nickels and dimes and quarters.
The market crash changed everything. October 29, 1929, known as Black Tuesday, was the beginning of the Great Depression.
We used to eat rats for dinner. My mother sent me and my brother down to get rats out of the river, you know, and she'd fry them with kerosene lamps.
Just about everybody played policy. The policy business was the only hope that they had in terms of being able to eat dinner tonight.
It's mystic on some level. It's this idea, this glimmer that everyone's in search of, some life-changing moment that's going to change the circumstance that they're in. If you were sitting in some little cold water flat on the south side of the city of Chicago, all you had to do was have your number come up and you were going to be okay. And it didn't matter whether you won or lost, you just had to have the ability to win and the understanding that if you did win, you were going to be paid.
What was a nickel and dime racket got transformed into a multi-million-dollar business enterprise and becomes the biggest policy wheel, not in just Chicago, but in the country.
Back in those days, they were generating supposedly $15,000, $20,000 a day just on small change. My uncle, John Willie, and he had a policy wheel with your grandfather, Ed Jones. There was a Vienna bathhouse on 41st in Indiana. And back in the 30s, they didn't service blacks. He went in there and he was, you know, he was a big guy and real fair complected. But he went in there and they told him they didn't service Negroes. So he went back the next day and he bought it, paid cash for it, and fired them all.
Blacks were playing policy more than ever. When whites started playing as well, policy kings were on a roll, and my grandfather was making more than anyone. Now that he was rich and successful, doors were beginning to open, even in New York.
Black people were not admitted to the Cotton Club, but my father was well known at that moment, and so they let him in. My mother was dancing at the Cotton Club. She was, I think, part of the chorus. He would always talk about how she looked so beautiful. He invited her to the table, and they fell in love.
He was extremely charming. He was a classy man, highly intelligent, very contained and controlled, with a great sense of humor. And Lena Horne was there at the same time. And he used to love to tell the joke and laugh. He'd say, well, I had the choice of Lena Horne. He said, and I had the choice of Lydia. He said, I think I made the best choice. Yeah.
He left the following day, but they kept sending letters to each other, talking to each other. My mother would tell the story to me that one day they went out on the town and she got my father a little tipsy and they married. When we lived in Chicago, it was one building and each one had a floor. My father was on the first floor, Uncle Mac was on the second floor, and Uncle George was on the third floor. My grandmother was across the street. After my grandfather died, there was a doctor who wanted to marry her. She was a young woman, she was an attractive woman, and her 3 sons said, no. You can't marry. And so then she said, okay, if I don't marry, you have to come and visit me every day because I don't want to be alone. And so the sons, they would visit her. She was a very strict woman. I don't think my grandmother liked my mother very much. Maybe because she was a showgirl, so I really don't know, but I don't think she liked her. And I remember my mother telling me when she was 25 years old, she began smoking because my grandmother said something sort of demeaning to her. My father never took my mother's side against his mother, you know, to tell her, okay, just leave her alone or whatever. No, because she was very fragile.
My parents owned a home on Michigan Avenue, a block away from the school, so that's where I attended school. And very well-to-do black children went there. I had no idea Harriet was attending at the same time.
We lived a privileged life. When I say a privileged life, I mean that we had people taking care of us. We had a cook, we had a chauffeur.
My father was a carpenter for all of the Jones boys. He built their homes. I met your grandfather at a birthday party at his house. I think it was Harriet's birthday. And she asked me to give her a haircut. She was 5 years old, I was 7. And I made the mistake of giving her a haircut and I cut all of her hair off. And my father kicked my booty. He said, do you know who her father is? I said, I don't know, 7 years old, you don't know what's going on, you know.
I don't want to be no hero. I don't need to
This location is known as a place where all the big stars come to party and hang out.
I ain't got no money to buy you clothes. I ain't got a dime. I can't take you out to bars and fancy shows. No, sorry, baby. I don't got $1 million. I don't own no rocks and pearls. I don't live the high life, baby. I just want you in my world.
These guys were making tons of money, hobnobbing with the rich folks and the politicians and all of this kind of thing. People are going to come after them. People are going to do whatever they have to do to separate these guys from this money. In the 1930s, this block was a virtual fortress. Bodyguards all up and down this block.
In Chicago, he had bodyguards. That I remember.
Did you ever hear that your father was violent?
My father was never violent. Never. 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 No, never.
Did he carry a gun?
Of course he never carried a gun.
Everybody carried guns. He had to protect himself because they was trying to kill him.
She always tries to make him into a saint, you know. I said, but baby, he's a gangster.
My father was never a gangster.
A gangster's a gangster. A gangster will do whatever it takes to do his thing, to survive, you know. It's normal.
Al Capone had his own alliance with Policy Kings. Before Capone left the city going to prison for tax evasion in 1931, a lot of the illegal liquor that found its way to the South from the North was shipped in coffins of dead black people going home for burial. As long as they helped move his liquor, he left them alone in their gambling business.
In Chicago, the organized crime group is called the Mob, also called the Outfit.
Al Capone was a gangster. Ed Jones was a racketeer. Capone used the gun to get what he wanted. Ed Jones used the gun to protect what he had.
They weren't going down the streets shooting at people. They had guns to protect themselves against them hunkies that might be coming over trying to get some of that money.
One thing about policy is it was just policy. Now, within the outfit, you had gambling, you had prostitution. During Prohibition, you had alcohol.
Policy Kings didn't force their racket on anybody. They didn't invade other communities. They essentially minded their own business. As opposed to the mob, violence was a prerogative of the Italian mob, and that's what they were all about. They used violence to further all of their activities. The mob was involved in the kidnapping of Mac Jones in order to force their way in.
If there was trouble, Ted Rowe would be sent. He was like their front man.
There was some sort of a ransom paid by Teddy Rowe, but they didn't harm him during the kidnapping. They didn't beat him, they didn't torture him.
1931 was an underworld orgy of murder. David Giles, very close friend of Ed Jones, is murdered by these gangsters. When he was murdered, that changed everything. His murder caused the single biggest meeting of Policy Kings in this city's history. And that's when Ed started talking about organizing. We can all fight these guys individually by ourselves and get knocked off one by one, or we can all unify and deal with this thing as a unit. Ed made that happen. This is the beginning of the rise of the policy syndicate. Ed Jones is the founder and the head of the syndicate. So we're talking about a syndicate of 12 people. 3 of these people are the Jones brothers, and then the rest of these guys are a collection of men who are independently operating their own policy businesses.
As head of the syndicate, my grandfather was nicknamed Big Head by some, Emperor Jones by others, but for most, he was the King of Kings.
Prohibition era was over. Everybody is looking for new revenue streams. This is during the Depression. And the guys who were making all the money were these black guys on the south side of Chicago.
At that time, it wasn't easy to do what he did. And these guys to come up and even look like they look and have their ties on and take care of themselves, have their physical appearance, with respect, I love that. I love that, and that stuck with me real strong, As a young kid, you see that, you say, that's what I've got to do. You want to be what you see. It was a sign of hope, He had all of the intelligence, the eloquence, the sensitivity, everything, passion. He had it all, because you need that to be a leader. And he was definitely a leader, honey. And back at a time when it was difficult.
Money had brought my grandfather the semblance of a respectable life. But behind the facade, everything was illegal, as policy was illegal. His influence, however, in Chicago was considerable and extended all the way to City Hall.
The common sentiment of the day was that the Republicans could not control the city because of all of the gangsterism and all of the killing that was going on from the Capone mob and their rivals. The outgoing Republican mayor was Thompson, Big Bill Thompson.
There are those who would have you believe that Chicago is the crime-ridden center of our country or the world. It is untrue.
Whatever money is being generated with illegal gambling and illegal liquor, he wants to control it for himself. He's sending cops out here. Police raids, they crack down on everybody. In comes Anton Cermak, Democrat. Cermak's issue is that he doesn't really like black people. But the Democrats are jockeying for position. They knew they couldn't do it by themselves. So they looked to the single most influential black man in Chicago at that time. It was not a preacher. It was not a businessman or a banker. It was Ed Jones.
Historically, African Americans were Republican in the city of Chicago. And Ed Jones had a lot to do with the shift from Republican to Democrat. Being able to deliver the whole south side of Chicago for your candidate was critically important. You had a series of mayors. Big Bill Thompson was a very corrupt person. He was followed by Anton Cermak, who tried to straighten some of this out, but still he wanted control of that, of the policy people, particularly because of their votes.
Cermak says, if your people switch their allegiance to the Democratic Party, actions of the police department will stop. Vote how we tell you to vote, we'll leave you alone.
It wasn't really about ideological loyalty to a party. It was the party that was going to provide you with the greatest protection so that your criminal enterprise could operate unscathed with the protection of the police and other politicians, making sure that your business wasn't interrupted.
All these guys, even the Italian mob, they're a product of their times. They're a product of social disorganization, of poverty, of the government not doing its job. You can't have organized crime without a corrupt government.
Police would come in and bet too. You write their bets, the police, the firemen, everybody. I wrote for all of them. Because when they had raids, everybody knew. Because they would call me and say, hey, get ready, they coming. Get the stuff up. Get somebody ready. They're gonna need to take somebody in.
At some point, all of the money and everything is going to end up at this address. The police that worked for them would pull up here at the specified time, and the guys would come out carrying these satchels of money, put them in the car. Sometimes it was your great-uncle Mac, sometimes it was your great-uncle George. Ed rarely did it himself. But they load these cars up with Ted Rowe, and they would be flanked by police cars, following them to the bank to deposit this money. This is all cash business. They had this contract with the Hawthorne Milk Company to deliver milk to all of the black public schools. Every truck that was going in and out of here delivering milk to the schools were also making policy pickups.
They had an operation that was going exceedingly well, that was earning more than $1 million annually, employing 10,000 people.
The Jones brothers, because of their educational background, were more than just gamblers. They had lawyers, they had accountants, they were businessmen.
The Jones brothers were financing med students out of school, setting up medical practices, doctors and dentists, law students.
I would have to call them the Robin Hoods of Chicago during Depression 30s. They were Robin Hoods because they took care of their people.
Ed Jones was famous for giving away food at Christmas time. He also invested in Joe Louis, the fighter. He provided a tremendous amount of pride for the black community.
He invested in his people. He owned a big store on the south side of the city of Chicago in areas that big business really wasn't touching. He empowered the people that lived there by letting them have the same retail options that people on the north side have.
Time magazine declared Bronzeville the U.S. Center of Negro business.
The policy rackets provided people with an income, and the millions of dollars that were generated were invested back into the community and purchasing of legal businesses. So it was an underground economy that thrived.
My grandfather must have known that by empowering the black community, he would sooner or later become a target. Regardless, he did it, opening doors and setting an example for others to follow. But the challenge remained enormous. Being confined to the Chicago South Side, known then as the Black Belt, soon became a problem.
The population density in Bronzeville was 4 times that in adjoining white communities like Hyde Park, Kenwood. In Hyde Park, Kenwood, the population would be 21,000 per square mile. In Bronzeville, 84,000 per square mile. So we were constantly moving to find more space. Neighborhood being overcrowded meant the schools were overcrowded. And so every time parents could find a place where their children could go to a less crowded school, they moved so that their children would have a better education.
My father took us to a very good school, and he asked for us to be in the school, and they said, no, we don't take black children, we don't take colored children.
Les Blancs, du temps de l'esclavage puis de la ségrégation au Sud, se sont toujours assurés que les Noirs n'aient qu'un minimum d'éducation, parce que l'éducation, c'est le pouvoir. Et cela s'est traduit par une politique tout à fait active de privation d'éducation décente, qui passait par le fait de garder pour les Blancs les meilleurs professeurs, les meilleurs établissements et les meilleurs bâtiments. L'intégration des écoles a suscité la plus grande réaction blanche que toutes les mesures des droits civiques. Et on a vu très vite des familles blanches retirer leurs enfants des écoles du moment que les Noirs étaient inscrits pour les mettre dans le privé, pour les mettre dans des private academies, et on a vu ça à Chicago aussi.
I think all of that was a reason for us to move to France.
Even if they were very light-skinned and could sometimes pass for whites, the establishment knew that they were black. My grandfather looked once more for ways to break the invisible chains of the past. Just as his father had done 14 years before, he moved so his children could grow up in a country where color wasn't an issue.
My father bought an apartment there on Boulevard Belgique. We could go to school there. They were very happy to be in France because there was no discrimination. They could go wherever they wanted. They could do whatever they wanted, and they loved that. They learned a bit of French. And my parents saw Josephine Baker. I remember very vividly her with her chita. My parents, they enjoyed life. I remember my mother dressing up and looking so beautiful. My mother, she had a very difficult childhood. She was born in Hell's Kitchen in New York. She didn't have enough to eat. Her mother wasn't the best kind of mother, let's say that. When she was a little girl, 4 years old, someone would give her a little alcohol to drink, so she would dance. She was raped when she was 13 years old. She had a little baby girl, my sister Dorothy. A very nice family took her and she went to live in West Virginia. My mother, she began working very young. One of the jobs that she had was an elevator girl. And then all of a sudden she realized that she was a pretty young woman, and that's when she traveled to Europe and her life changed.
Her beginnings were very difficult. And I think that's why my grandmother started dancing, just to try to make it to survive.
In Paris, she was in La Revue Nègre with Josephine Baker. They were roommates.
Their happiness in Paris was short-lived. Once more, they had to flee.
We lived there until the war started. And I remember the sirens. You had to run into the closet and put on the gas mask. And I can still smell the smell of the gas mask. And my father got us the last tickets on a ship going back to the States. A friend of the family told us that the Germans had their headquarters in the apartment where we lived.
Edward Jones and his family returned to Chicago, where his empire was now under attack. During their 2 years abroad, they changed, but America didn't.
I know my great-grandfather went to jail.
Do I know why he went to jail? I didn't even know he went to jail.
I have no clue why he went to jail.
Why did he go to jail?
When the feds went after the Jones brothers, it really didn't have anything to do with gambling or hiding money and not reporting money on your income tax return, though that's what he got pinched for. That's not really what it was about. It was about the black community at large and the most influential people who are making a difference. Those people have to be marginalized, so that black agenda does never progress to the point that it's on even par with ours. That can never happen. All of the brothers and the mother were all named for tax evasion. The deal that he cut was to first get his mother off the hook. She never had to answer for any of this legally. That's something that Ed made absolute sure of. His mother would never see a day in jail. Ed flew out with a check, but they wouldn't accept it.
The Jones brothers felt if they didn't plead guilty, that all three of them would be in prison. And Ed agreed to be the person who would take the responsibility.
He felt that his brother George could not take the time in jail, would not have the, the mettle to do the time. So he took the jail time for him.
After they had indicted them, after they had frozen their bank accounts, they ended up giving them back $850,000. That's admitting without admitting that the government was wrong. The white establishment that has controlled all of this for all these generations have never been willing to talk about that. They never want to acknowledge that someone black actually had more power, more knowledge, and more insight than they did.
I was a little girl and I didn't know that he was going to jail. They told me that he had gone to the war. I heard that when he went to jail, they made an IQ test and they had never seen such a high IQ. And so they put him in solitary.
Sam Giancana was there for operating an illegal whiskey still. They struck up a friendship probably because they were both from Chicago. Sam Giancana was a congenital criminal. He made his name because of his viciousness as a killer. His entire life was engaged in criminal activities. African Americans were not regarded in high stature, and I think he was presenting himself to Sam Giancana as an equal.
Sam Giancana proposed to my father to work for him and that he would give him something like $100 a week. And my father said, "Are you crazy, man?"
That's when he revealed to this white Italian gangster how much money there was in the policy business.
I'm sure he bragged. I mean, I'm sure they were all bragging. That's what people do in jail. You know, that's what men do out of jail. That's what men do. They brag about what they've got.
Huge mistake. Of course, he shouldn't have talked. He should have kept it, but it's easy to say that afterwards. Maybe it was a way of, maybe he wanted to impress these guys. Maybe it was a way of keeping safe. Maybe it was, I don't know, whatever it was. But yeah, obviously he shouldn't have talked.
His 2 years in prison marked a turning point in the life of my grandfather, as Sam Giancana's ambitions had no limits.
When Jones got out, he wanted to get involved with the mob, putting jukeboxes all over the south side of Chicago because the outfit controlled the jukeboxes. He saw that as a way to really expand his own empire, and that was a big mistake. The way that the outfit always worked, once they brought you in, now they owned you. Once they brought him in to the jukebox racket, they wanted more.
Mr. Jones's colleagues did not look favorably on his interactions with the Italians. Theodore Rolfo warned him to stay away, and he was right.
The Giacomos and the Capones were, they didn't play boy. They'd take you out. Chicago is a rough city, honey.
Your business gets so big, then they say, okay, now you got to turn the business into us. Now you got a new partner. And when you resisted, they gave you a warning. The warning was you was a hospital case. And they would break your legs with the baseball bat, put you in the hospital, come back out, and you go back to work. The second warning, you was going to be buried. So you don't get another chance. That's how they operated.
I remember my father, he took the phone, and I knew intuitively that something terrible had happened.
My husband told me that he was murdered, that he was shot down by the gangsters. Now, I don't know what gangsters. The story was never confirmed to me. Lydia didn't, well, naturally, she didn't want to talk about it, and Ed never mentioned it. The only thing, we knew that he was killed, and that was sort of kept very, very quiet. The Italians started threatening Ed. They threatened to kidnap their children, and Ed had all sorts of bodyguards around the school, and he decided to just say, okay, this is it, my family is in danger, and that's when he took his family and went to Mexico.
He fled with his brother, taking with him supposedly as much as $14 million to Mexico.
I credit your grandfather for disengaging them, because a lot of people do well and they just can't do well enough.
We always traveled by train because my father had a phobia for planes.
Once again, my grandfather and his family were being chased. Neither money nor power were enough to keep them safe in the US. It was time to move again.
We were privileged because we had our own compartments. When we got to Texas, my father would say, pull down the shades. We don't want people coming in and pulling us out. Because there was a lot of discrimination. When we first came to Mexico, it was only my father and mother and the 3 children. We realized that we weren't going back when we started school. I I don't think the teacher was very happy having someone who didn't speak one word of Spanish. She put me in the back of the room and gave me a book, and she said, write down the whole book. So you can believe me, I know how to write Spanish so well. My father would import cars from the United States into Mexico. The thing that my father loved the most in Mexico was his silk screen factory, and all of the people who worked there, they loved him. It was very successful.
When Ed went to Mexico, everything was legitimate. Lydia had a wonderful shop on Reforma Boulevard. She had modeling, she had beautiful clothes.
While this is happening, Ted steps up. So all these times Ed is taking off out of here, it's Ted that's running the business because it's Ted that he trusts the most.
We went by the house in Mexico. He said, "This is Quincy Jones." He said, "Quincy Jones?" He said, "You that little bastard that cut my daughter's hair?" I said, "Oh, God, no."
Josephine Baker came to Mexico. My father financed her tour to the States. She was really a feisty woman. She was incredible in that we would take the train because my father wouldn't let her either take the plane. She would go where everybody was sitting and she would begin saying, "It's terrible what's happening here in the States. How can you people be discriminated?" My mother would say, "Josephine, you're gonna get us all killed." The debut was in Boston and very few people came out. The place was empty. I remember turning around and it was very empty. People admire her so much in France, and she was used to that. They gave her the Légion d'honneur, and she was a personality in France. And in the States, she was just another black person.
Joséphine Baker, de retour d'une longue tournée en Amérique, est accueillie par ses amis parisiens.
While the Jones brothers were in Mexico, Pedro ran the day-to-day business in the Windy City. But my grandfather, as head of the company, often made discreet trips to Chicago to attend to his various affairs.
They were leaving the Ben Franklin store. They come down South Parkway, and as soon as they park, out of nowhere, here comes another car. One guy jumps out of the car and puts a shotgun in front of Brock's face. Brock is the driver, one of the longtime bodyguards for the Jones brothers. They snatch Ed out of the car, throw him on the floor of the back seat of the getaway car, take off. Ed's wife, Lydia, is screaming for help. As it so happened, a police car just happened to be coming along. She points out what happened. The chase ensues.
Really? He had been kidnapped? I have never heard of that. Was it in Mexico?
My grandmother used to tell me the story of how he got kidnapped. They took him out of the car, and she used to tell me that she ran after the car and they started shooting at her.
Ed Jones was kidnapped by the mob in order for them to force their way in. Jones refused to let the mob in, so now we're going to take it.
When my father was kidnapped, I had no idea. People didn't tell their children about different things like that, no. He told me that he was blindfolded the whole time, and they put a gun to his head, and he thought that maybe this is my last day.
The initial ransom was for $250,000, but somewhere along the way it was reported that the demand had been dropped down to $100,000. The drop was made, and at some point Ed was released in the middle of the night The kidnappers were never caught.
That's what I imagine Sam Giancana said to your grandfather. You've lost Chicago privileges. You can continue to live and you can go out and you can take the money that you've made, but from now on, this is my business.
Supposedly, Sam Giancana visited Teddy Rowe in his bar, and Teddy Rowe punched him and knocked him on the ground, which showed that Teddy Rowe was a fearless man to strike the boss of organized crime.
Ted carried 2 guns, was a very good shot, and wasn't taking any crap from anybody. Sam Giancana liked to push people around. Ted wasn't being pushed around.
Sam Giancana tried to assassinate him, but Teddy Rowe and his bodyguard struck back and killed a made member of the outfit, Marshal Carfano's brother, Fat Lenny.
He wasn't like most people. When gangsters showed up at your door, people more or less gave up. Teddy Rowe didn't. He fought them. There was something that was totally unheard of at that particular time.
In 1951, my grandfather was subpoenaed to appear in front of the Kefauver Committee. Once again, the noose was tightening.
We have shown the interstate connections of the wire service, of the policy racket, of other kinds of gambling, and we have also, in our investigation, will show certain economic effects of organized crime.
And the Kefauver Commission was one of the first governmental entities to actually expose the amount of money that was being earned out there but through crime and criminal enterprise. It brought a bright light on something that was really unknown to 90% of America at the time.
Have you given contributions to any political organization while you were in Chicago?
Well, I wouldn't say no, nothing in a very definite manner. Maybe if I had a precinct captain, someone in there was looking for a donation or something at election time, possibly I'd give him something to help him out.
Would you make a practice of that every election?
Well, I wouldn't say you'd make a practice of it, but I guess if he came around...
You wouldn't make a practice of refusing in any event, would you?
Well, I don't think so. I don't think I never gave that much thought.
Did you contribute to any one party in particular or to both?
To both.
Anybody who asked you would give a contribution?
Well, that was a natural thing.
You're going to have to speak a little louder. The reporters are having a lot of difficulty understanding.
Did the precinct captains in your district know the business you were in?
Well, I don't think they were so interested. Maybe, I guess so, but not to any great extent. They were more interested in getting the votes.
Did the police in your district know the business you were in?
Well, I never knew that.
Try to speak up.
Well, I'm trying as hard as I can if I'm not speaking loud enough.
Now you're just whispering.
No, I'm right.
The joke was, Estes Kefauver was one of the biggest gamblers in this country. How are you going to trust these guys? We know for a fact they're crooked because we're the ones that's been paying them off.
Then you have an automobile agency in Mexico City?
Yes, sir.
And what is Jones and Payne?
That was a milk business that we had, was on the south side.
Do you still have that?
No, we sold it.
When did you sell it?
Last year?
Then you have some property you rent?
Yes, sir.
1958.
This year, huh? We sold the milk business this year. You pardon me, please.
Sold it this year?
Yes, sir.
There's an item, station income. Could you state what that is?
Station income?
Yes.
No, I don't know what that is.
Small item, it's $700
Station?
Do you have any station of any kind?
For me?
Yes.
Gasoline station? Oh, I guess that must be something, revenue derived from a power station. But it's not my income, I think. It must be my wife's income or something.
Policy station?
I guess, I don't know.
What kind of a policy station would that be?
Excuse me just a moment.
Ted Rowe volunteered to testify in front of the Kefauver Committee, and he explained everything. He explained the whole policy set up on the south side of Chicago, and I think it was his way of getting back at Sam Giancana to expose the effort of the mob to take over a black enterprise.
Edward Jones and Ted Rowe walked away free from the indictment, but both must have known by now that as descendants of slaves, their freedom could never be taken for granted.
Teddy Rowe then ensconced himself in his mansion on Michigan Avenue, the building is still there, and had bodyguards surrounding him.
This is the home of Ted Rowe, Policy King Ted Rowe, Chief Lieutenant of the Jones Brothers policy and gambling operations. This is where he lived, and precisely that tree is where he died. He had left the garage around the corner to change cars. They offered to drop him off, but he said, no, I'm just gonna run home. So he drove himself from the garage here, goes in the house, comes back outside just about 10 o'clock at night.
As legend has it, he learned that he had terminal cancer, called his bodyguards off, knew the end was inevitable, went outside, walked the streets unprotected.
Ted Rowe, he was tough, boy. Oh, it was tough, honey. He was really tough. That's why they took him out in such a brutal way. After they killed Rowe, it was almost over. All of the black communities in America were involved in that, playing the numbers. Did you play the number? What figure did you play today? You know, that was as ghetto as you could get, you know.
This takeover probably couldn't happen without political blessing. Now, you might say, why was that when they provided so many votes? My personal opinion is that the regular Democratic Party was afraid of the black vote. Black consciousness was evolving. They might run a black for mayor. So by denying policy money to the black community, they were protecting their long-term interests. They were denying blacks the money to build or support a strong African-American candidate to run the city of Chicago.
The glory days of black people controlling this neighborhood, all of that was over. Once the mob moved in, they took over the nightclubs. They took over all the legitimate business operations as well as the gambling operations.
My grandfather's legacy was beginning to be erased in Chicago, where he had once been called the King of Kings, and with it, the memory of the so-called policy kings.
one day they were talking on the phone, my mother and my father, and my mother said, he's not well. And I said, do you think it's serious? And she said, yes, I do. And then my father came to Chicago and they discovered that he had a cancer. And they operated on him and they told him, well, you probably have 5 years to live, and that's what he had. My father was there for my mother always, and my mother was there for my father always. It was Thanksgiving, and it was freezing in Chicago. It was -15. And Daddy, my father said, no, don't go. We realized that that was it, and I remember holding him, and my mother was right there with him. And it was so beautiful the way he died. It was so beautiful because he looked up and he saw something. For about half an hour or 3/4 of an hour, he saw something, and it was just beautiful to see that. It took away all you can't be frightened of death when you see someone going in that sense. Yeah. So.
When Ed passed, we were in the funeral home, and Mac said Giancana is going to pull up in the back alley. We watched these guys, and they came in. It was like 6 of them, tall, real big guys, just like the movies, with the long coats and everything. And they inspected the funeral home, and then they threw themselves up, and he came through like a king to pay his respects to Lydia.
Part of the mystery surrounding my grandfather had been lifted, but many questions remained. The search is not over. In his will, he left everything to his wife and made his brother an executor of the trust. But now that Edward Jones was gone, things didn't go according to plan.
There was property all over the South Side. There were big, big apartment buildings, beautiful places.
They had money in 25 different banks around the world.
They made about $110, $115 million, which was equivalent to about $1 billion then.
Uncle George was always very jealous of Ed. After Edward died, he capitalized on the situation. He just completely took over because now, for the first time, he could be in charge.
When Ed died, Lydia was made the president of the corporation. Lydia spent a lot of time with Harriet in France, and Uncle George would send all these business papers over for Lydia to sign. And she didn't take time to really read what she was signing. She would just sign and send it back.
He used to come up from Mexico and have tons and tons of paper. And he would say, okay, Lydia, I need you to sign here. And she would sign all these papers. And finally, I said to her, Grandma Lydia, what are you doing? Why aren't you reading these? What are you signing? And she would say, it doesn't matter. My husband's not here anymore, and she would continue signing.
One day, Lydia discovered that she was no longer president of the corporation. For the liquidation of Edward Jones's entire estate, my grandmother received a check for $25,000. George's wife had been made the new president. Growing up, we had no idea that my grandfather had once been one of the richest men in America.
Mom would never talk about her past. Was it painful memories in terms of the loss that she still hadn't accepted it? I think she was ashamed of having had all that money and all that wealth.
Notre grand-père, il a fait sa fortune avec la loterie. Cette loterie, même à l'heure actuelle, c'est les plus pauvres qui jouent. Pour maman, ça a été quelque chose de très difficile à accepter, que la fortune que notre grand-père a eue venait de personnes défavorisées et qui, par-dessus le marché, c'était des personnes de couleur.
Looking at my grandfather's story, I asked myself, what was there to be ashamed of? Policy was an illegal business, but it was not an immoral business. Let's put that into perspective. Slavery was legal, but it was highly immoral. Realizing the game was rigged, my grandfather just refused to be confined in the box in which centuries of conditioning had put African Americans.
Ed was a person that believed the sky was the limit and there was nothing that a black man could not do. He asked me in his deep voice, "What do you want to be, baby?" And I said, "All I know is I want to go to college." He paid my way, and it's because of him that I did get my degree. He was busy trying to help other black people become business owners because he understood that you can't work for other people your entire life and expect to live your life exactly the way you want. One of the people that he helped is Mr. Johnson of Ebony magazine. He gave him the money that he needed to start his business, and the rest is history.
Say it loud! I'm black and I'm proud. Say it loud! Soul brother number one.
In Chicago and America these days, the new mood and message of the country's Negroes comes over loud and clear. Negro-owned radio stations punch home the theme.
Good morning, Chicago. Eddie Morrison here, and it's so nice to have you there. Say it loud. I'm black and I'm proud. Go ahead, James. Say it loud. I'm black and I'm proud. One more time. Say it loud. I worked on jobs.
Mom would have us repeat all the time, "I'm black and I'm proud."
I'm black and I'm proud. Say it loud. I'm black and I'm proud.
Which was funny when you think about it, a bit ridiculous because at the time, honestly, I had no notion of race. I didn't see myself different from any white, black, or any other kids. I was just a kid.
Nous étions censés porter la bannière noire avec beaucoup de panache. Et les gens, ils s'en fichaient complètement. Ils n'en avaient rien à cirer de quelle couleur on était.
Since I lived most of my life in Europe and had never suffered from discrimination, I found it difficult to understand what my mother or my grandfather had gone through. After this journey, I see things differently, and this song has a new resonance. Today, I abolish boundaries, starting with the ones in my head. Edward Jones died in 1964, the year the Civil Rights Act was voted in, finally ending legal segregation in the United States. In his hometown of Chicago, I had a very hard time finding any information about policy or the African American men that were behind it. There was nothing in the Chicago History Museum, but as I kept on looking, all I could find was a few pieces in the hands of a private collector.
I haven't finished cleaning up, but it's presentable enough. These are policy slips from the 1920s. Policy was an economic arm of the black community. There was the arm that kept the black community in a position to be independent politically. Lou Caldwell was a state representative. He really championed the cause of policy. He wanted to make policy a legal business because African Americans controlled it.
As hard as he tried, Lou Caldwell and his entourage could never get policy legalized. But others ended up doing so.
The Illinois State Lottery. As evil as they tried to paint this picture of policy when it was in the hands of black men, somewhere along the way, it became good enough for white men to turn into the state lottery. So I don't think God had anything to do with that.
Policy is known today under another name. The Illinois State Lottery started in 1974. Since then, it has generated nearly $1 trillion, and most of that money is derived from the black community.
The money that used to be generated by your grandfather and his guys took care of the people in the neighborhood. Doesn't anymore. In the 1980s, states formally legislated lottery money to pay for public education. Public schools have been closed down all across this country. The money from state lottery is still being generated, but it hasn't been spent on public education. So the big question is, where is all of this money?
Poverty without inspiration and examples took over this neighborhood.
When I set out on this journey, I knew next to nothing about my family's history or the part my grandfather, Edward Jones, had played in the American narrative. A narrative often only seen from one perspective.
You're talking about a people that was once, despite what history has told us, were on a very progressive, self-sufficient track. Well, that does not always make your oppressor happy. What these guys did was virtually lift that foot of oppression off the neck so we were able to move forward. That's what it was all about, progression.
Barack Obama would have gotten to the top so fast anywhere else in the country than Chicago. We had some guys called the Jones brothers who financed businesses and other things that made us all successful so that he could see the success. The door was going to be open. Be ready to walk in.
The door did open, but was it wide enough? The one-drop rule and the Jim Crow laws are things of the past. But who represents African Americans today?
I'm just stuck here in a dream.
Tant que certains penseront que dire la vérité sur la suprématie blanche, c'est quelque chose de culpabilisant, c'est quelque chose qui est trop difficile à avaler, c'est quelque chose d'inconfortable, et tant qu'on n'acceptera pas cet inconfort, eh bien, il faudra compter sur les Africains-Américains pour dire leur propre histoire, mais encore faut-il leur laisser le faire. C'est difficile, le pouvoir n'est jamais donné, disait Frédéric Douglass. Il est toujours arraché. Donc il faut arracher le pouvoir de dire son histoire.
It's just so important to understand your history because if you know where you come from, that helps you get where you're going, you know.
Voilà un Américain noir qui a quitté les États-Unis et sa descendance vient de tous les pays du monde. Et en même temps, on est très américaine, puisque les États-Unis sont ce melting pot. Quand moi, je dis que je suis américaine, ça n'étonne personne, parce que même avec mon accent déplorable en anglais, je suis une américaine, je suis complètement américaine, et parce que je suis ce que les États-Unis représentent, un mélange de race, un mélange de langue, un mélange de tout. Et je pense que That's the legacy of my grandfather.
I know now for sure that the blood running through my veins has an amazing, colorful past. By digging into my family's history and by telling my grandfather's story, I'm giving Edward Jones back his place in the world.
Birds flying high, you know how I feel. Sun in the sky, you know how I feel. Breeze drifting on by, you know how I feel. It's a new dawn, it's a new day. It's a new life for me, yeah. It's a new dawn, it's a new day. It's a new life for me. Ooh, ooh, ooh. And I'm feeling good. Fish in the sea, you know how I feel. River running free, you know how I feel. Blossom on the tree, you know how I feel. It's a new dawn, it's a new day, it's a new life for me. And I'm feeling good. Dragonfly out in the sun, you know what I mean, don't you know? Butterflies all having fun, you know what I mean. Sleep in peace when day is done, that's what I mean. And this old world is a new world and a bold world for me. When you shine, you know how I feel. Scent of the pine, you know how I feel. Oh, freedom is mine, and I know how I feel. It's a new dawn, it's a new day, it's a new life.